In November 2022, a company worth $32 billion collapsed in 8 days. At its center was a 30-year-old man who wore the same rumpled t-shirt and cargo shorts to meetings with senators, hedge fund billionaires, and the president of Ukraine. He testified in front of Congress. He was one of the largest political donors in America, and underneath all of it, prosecutors would later prove was one of the largest financial frauds in U.S. history, a hole in the balance sheet of roughly $8 billion in customer money that simply wasn't there anymore. I'm Lat, and today I'm explaining the story of Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX. Sam Bankman grew up the child of two Stanford law professors, studied physics at MIT, and fell in with a community of effective altruists, people who believe you should choose your career specifically to maximize the amount of good you can do in the world, often by earning as much money as possible and giving almost all of it away. It's a real, serious philosophical movement with plenty of thoughtful people in it. For Bankman-Fried, it became the justification for almost everything. After college, he took a job at Jane Street Capital, one of the most secretive and successful quantitative trading firms on Wall Street, the kind of place that hires physics and math majors to find tiny, repeatable pricing inefficiencies and trade them at massive scale. He was good at it, and it was at Jane Street that he learned the trading strategy that would define his entire career: arbitrage, finding the same asset priced differently in two places and pocketing the difference. By 2019, Bankman-Fried had a new problem. Alameda was trading actively on crypto exchanges around the world, and he'd grown frustrated with how clunky and unreliable most of them were for professional traders. So he decided to build his own. FTX launched in 2019, co-founded with Gary Wang, a former Google engineer and one of Bankman-Fried's oldest friends. The pitch to the crypto world was straightforward: a fast, professional-grade exchange built by people who actually understood trading, with better tools than the competition. It worked. FTX grew explosively. By 2021, it was one of the largest crypto exchanges on Earth, valued at over $18 billion, with backing from some of the most respected venture capital firms in the world: Sequoia Capital, SoftBank, Temasek, and dozens of others, who collectively poured in roughly $2 billion. FTX moved its headquarters to the Bahamas in 2021, officially for regulatory reasons. The Bahamas had passed crypto-friendly legislation that made it easier to operate there than in the more heavily scrutinized U.S. market. Bankman-Fried and his inner circle relocated to a $30 million penthouse compound, and the exchange became the highest-profile sponsor in crypto. Stadium naming rights with the Miami Heat, a Super Bowl commercial starring Larry David, endorsement deals with Tom Brady and Steph Curry. FTX was a cryptocurrency exchange. Like a stock brokerage, its core promise to customers was, you deposit money with us, we hold it safely, and you can trade or withdraw it whenever you want. That promise, that customer deposits are kept separate and safe, is the entire foundation of trust an exchange needs to operate. It's why banks are required to keep customer deposits distinct from the bank's own trading activities. Alameda Research, remember, was Bankman-Fried's separate trading firm, the one that predated FTX and that he still controlled. According to trial testimony from Gary Wang and Caroline Ellison, who by 2022 had become Alameda's CEO and who was also, for a time, Bankman-Fried's girlfriend, Alameda was given something no other trader on FTX had: a secret, essentially unlimited line of credit funded directly by FTX customer deposits. Technically, this was built into FTX's own code. Wang testified that he personally coded a feature, prosecutors called it a backdoor, that allowed Alameda's account to carry a negative balance, essentially letting it borrow far more than it had put up as collateral, without triggering the automatic liquidation that would happen to any other customer whose account went that deep underwater. At its peak, prosecutors say that credit line let Alameda draw down roughly $8 billion in customer funds. That money didn't sit idle. Testimony described it flowing into venture investments, real estate purchases in the Bahamas, loans to Bankman-Fried and other executives personally, more than $100 million in political donations split between Democratic and Republican causes, an amount that made Bankman-Fried one of the largest individual political donors in the country in the 2022 election cycle. The customers whose money this was had no idea any of it was happening. FTX's own terms of service explicitly told them their funds would not be used this way. This is maybe the most important question in the whole story. How does an $8 billion hole in a company's books stay invisible for years to some of the smartest investors and journalists in finance? A few answers, according to what came out at trial and in subsequent reporting. First, crypto exchanges weren't required to publish audited financial statements the way public companies are. FTX was privately held, and crypto as an industry has historically operated with far less regulatory oversight than traditional finance. There was no independent auditor cross-checking Alameda's books against FTX's customer deposit ledger because nobody was required to do that cross-check at all. Second, Bankman-Fried was an extraordinarily effective storyteller. He cultivated a specific, deliberate image, disheveled, awkward, uninterested in money for its own sake, driven by a higher philosophical purpose. Reporters and investors who might otherwise have asked harder questions about a crypto billionaire were disarmed by someone who drove a Corolla, slept on a beanbag chair at the office, and gave interviews about wanting to give away his entire fortune. It's worth being honest about this. The aw shucks genius persona wasn't incidental to the fraud. Testimony and later reporting suggest it functioned as a kind of camouflage, whether or not that was the conscious intent. Third, the venture capital firms that invested billions did remarkably little due diligence. Sequoia Capital later admitted, in an internal accounting that became public, that it had written its entire $214 million investment down to zero and acknowledged its diligence process had failed to catch the risk. Multiple investors have said in interviews and depositions that FTX's speed of growth and Bankman-Fried's reputation created pressure to move fast rather than dig deep. Fourth, and this is the one that came out in the most granular detail at trial, even inside the company, very few people had the full picture. Testimony from software engineers Adam Yedidia and Nishad Singh described a compartmentalized structure where only a small inner circle, Bankman-Fried, Ellison, Wang, and Singh, fully understood how deep Alameda's borrowing against customer funds actually went. And even within that circle, there's evidence some people were kept only partially informed for a long time. Yedidia testified he confronted Bankman-Fried directly in mid-2022 after discovering a discrepancy and was told the company's finances were not bulletproof, which he took at the time as a partial reassurance rather than the red flag it actually was. So, no external audits, a carefully managed public image, investors who didn't look hard enough, and an internal structure that kept even most employees in the dark. That combination bought years. It didn't buy forever. The end started with a single article. On November 2nd, 2022, the crypto news outlet CoinDesk published a story built on a leaked internal document, Alameda Research's balance sheet. Reporter Ian Allison found that a huge portion of Alameda's roughly $14.6 billion in listed assets, somewhere in the range of $5.8 billion, was FTT, the token FTX itself had invented and issued, essentially out of thin air. The story didn't cause an instant collapse, but it planted a seed of doubt with exactly the right person. Changpeng Zhao, CEO of Binance, FTX's biggest competitor, and, not coincidentally, an early FTX investor who had recently been bought out by Bankman-Fried and was sitting on a large pile of FTT tokens from that buyout. On November 6th, Zhao tweeted that, due to recent revelations, Binance would liquidate its entire FTT position. It's worth noting, Zhao had his own competitive incentives here, and the framing of this as pure altruistic concern versus competitive opportunism is genuinely disputed. Whatever the motive, the effect was immediate. FTT's price started falling, and FTX customers, increasingly worried after watching other crypto firms like Celsius and Voyager implode earlier that year, started pulling their money out fast. Caroline Ellison tried to calm the market, tweeting that the leaked balance sheet only reflected a subset of Alameda's entities and that Alameda held over $10 billion in assets not shown on it. Internally, though, according to her later testimony, the reality was the opposite of reassuring. The withdrawal rush was exposing a genuine, catastrophic gap. Over the next 72 hours, FTX faced roughly $5 to $6 billion in withdrawal requests, and it discovered, in real time, according to internal messages later revealed in court and reporting, that it simply didn't have the money to pay them because so much of what customers thought was sitting safely in their FTX accounts had actually been lent out to Alameda. By November 8th, FTX froze withdrawals entirely. Hundreds of thousands of customers, overnight, lost access to their own money. That same day, Binance's CZ announced a tentative agreement to acquire FTX and bail it out, a deal that, for a few hours, looked like it might contain the damage. It didn't last. Binance had seen enough to know this wasn't a liquidity problem it wanted to inherit. On November 11th, 2022, FTX, Alameda Research, and more than 130 affiliated entities filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in Delaware. Sam Bankman-Fried resigned as CEO the same day. This video took over a month to research, render, and edit, so I would greatly appreciate if you subscribed. Anyways, let's get back to the story. The person who took over FTX after the collapse is, in his own right, one of the more remarkable figures in this story. John J. Ray III, a corporate restructuring specialist who had previously overseen the wind-down of Enron after its own historic collapse in the early 2000s. FTX's board brought him in as the new CEO specifically to manage the bankruptcy. Ray's first official statement to the bankruptcy court became instantly widely quoted because of how blunt it was, coming from a man with 2 decades of experience untangling corporate disasters, including Enron. He said he had never seen in his entire career such a complete failure of corporate controls as he found at FTX. No accurate list of who worked for the company, no reliable accounting of what assets it actually held. Corporate funds used to buy personal real estate for executives, with, in his words, essentially no security or oversight. Ray's team, working with forensic accountants, began the process of actually reconstructing what happened to the money. And this is where the story shifts from public collapse to criminal investigation. The Department of Justice, the SEC, and the CFTC all opened simultaneous investigations within days of the bankruptcy filing. But the piece of the money trail that actually built the criminal case wasn't primarily forensic accounting from outside investigators. It was Bankman-Fried's own inner circle. Within weeks of the collapse, 3 of his closest colleagues and longtime friends, Caroline Ellison, Gary Wang, and Nishad Singh, all reached plea agreements with federal prosecutors, pleading guilty to fraud-related charges and agreeing to cooperate as witnesses against Bankman-Fried. Bankman-Fried was arrested in the Bahamas on December 12, 2022, at the request of U.S. authorities, and extradited to the United States later that month, and placed under house arrest at his parents' home in Palo Alto, California, pending trial. Bankman-Fried's trial began in October 2023 in the Southern District of New York in front of Judge Lewis Kaplan. His defense strategy centered on a claim of chaotic mismanagement rather than intentional fraud, that FTX's collapse was the result of disorganized rapid growth, bad risk management, and his own genuine failure to fully understand what Alameda was doing with customer funds, not deliberate theft. That defense ran directly into the testimony of the 3 cooperating witnesses, all of whom told the jury in detail that Bankman-Fried had known exactly what was happening and had directed key decisions himself. Ellison testified that Bankman-Fried directed her to send lenders balance sheets that concealed billions of dollars in liabilities. Wang testified about coding the mechanism that let Alameda draw on customer funds at Bankman-Fried's direction. Singh testified about being told to fabricate account balances. Bankman-Fried testified in his own defense and, according to multiple reporters in the courtroom, performed poorly under cross-examination, repeatedly claiming not to remember details that prosecutors could show he'd discussed extensively in internal communications. Judge Kaplan himself would later remark, at sentencing, that in nearly 30 years on the bench, he had never seen a performance quite like Bankman-Fried's evasiveness on the stand. On November 2, 2023, The jury convicted Bankman-Fried on all 7 counts. On March 28, 2024, Sam Bankman-Fried was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Prosecutors had pushed for up to 50 years, while his defense argued for just 5 to 6 years. Judge Lewis Kaplan rejected both extremes, but made it clear the scale of the fraud justified one of the harshest sentences ever handed down for a financial crime. The court found that at least $8 billion in customer funds had been lost, alongside $1.7 billion lost by FTX investors and $1.3 billion lost by Alameda's lenders. Kaplan called it one of the largest financial frauds of all time, warning that Bankman-Fried still posed a risk of committing similar crimes in the future. The judge also ordered the forfeiture of $11.02 billion in assets, which can help fund repayments to victims through the FTX bankruptcy process. Today, Sam Bankman-Fried is serving his sentence while appealing his conviction. Thank you for watching this video. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. Take care, and see you guys in the next one.